He sailed alone across the ocean, fleeing war and human greed. His boat was tossed about by the waves until one day he saw land. But this island wasn't on the map, and he soon understood why. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The wind that filled the sails of the Edelweiss smelled of tar, sweat, and distant promise. Europe, behind them, was a smudge of gray on the horizon, and already the sea was swallowing it, erasing the land that had shaped and starved them. Among the hundreds crammed aboard, each carried a version of the same dream fields of their own. Freedom from taxes and wars, a life no longer bound by lords or kings. But dreams, like the sails above their heads, strained against the ropes of reality. Johann Meyer stood apart from the crowd, his calloused hands resting on the worn rail. He was 30, though the years of hard labor and hunger had carved him into something older. The salt wind pressed against his face, but he barely noticed. He had worked with wood all his life. Houses, barns, the ribs of small fishing boats, and had believed that a man who could build was a man who belonged somewhere. But belonging had a cost. His brother had died in a war fought for a crown neither of them had ever seen, and his village had burned when the soldiers came for food and firewood. So when a recruiter promised land across the sea, Johann had signed his name without thinking. The voyage was long, the days marked by routine, mending planks, scraping tar from the deck, hauling ropes. He slept in the lower hold where the air was thick with damp and the breath of men dreaming of gold. At first, he told himself that the sea was freedom, that every mile westward was a mile away from the misery of Europe. But as the days passed, the conversations around him began to rot that belief. The officers spoke openly in the mess, their laughter coarse and proud. They did not talk of building or planting, but of conquest. They called the lands ahead empty, the people savages. They spoke of clearing forests, of taking women, of burning villages that refused the flag. The captain himself, a tall man with silver buckles and a pistol always at his hip, often reminded them that the crown rewarded bravery and obedience. Johann, silent among them, felt something cold crawl up his spine. He had thought they were settlers. He realized now they were soldiers, with plows for camouflage. Even the carpenters were to build more than houses. They would raise forts, fences, walls. Everything they touched would be claimed, renamed, and defended by fire. Johann began to work in silence, keeping to the edges of the deck where no one noticed him. When he heard the word New World, he could think only of an old sickness traveling with them, the same greed, the same arrogance, merely painted in another color. Nights were worse. The lower decks were a stinking warren of whispers and groans. The food spoiled quickly, and water turned sour in its barrels. When a young cabin boy fell ill and died within a day, the sailors rolled his body overboard, without ceremony. The splash echoed through the dark like a final punctuation mark in a story too often told. Johann lay awake long after, his hands clasped over his chest. The sound of the waves against the hull reminded him of shovels in loose earth. He began to write in a small notebook letters he would never send. "They sail to build a kingdom of chains," he wrote. "They call it freedom, because they will be the ones holding the keys." His handwriting wavered with the movement of the ship, and each word felt like a confession. He was not brave enough to speak aloud, but paper would listen. Weeks passed. The sea turned warmer, the sun harsher. The air smelled of salt and rot, and the wooden planks sweated underfoot. They were nearing the southern waters now, where storms were frequent and tempers shorter. The captain forced the men to drill with muskets daily. Johann watched them from the shadows, saw how quickly men learned to aim at shapes of straw, and imagined them as people. One evening, he overheard two officers laughing about a plan to burn the first native village they encountered. A demonstration, one said, to make them understand what happens to those who resist. The laughter that followed was not the sound of men, but of beasts. Johann felt something inside him break. He returned to his corner of the hold, where his few tools lay beside his hammock, and stared at his hands. They were hands meant to build, not destroy. Yet in this floating prison, every nail he hammered, every board he repaired, helped carry men toward slaughter. That night, he made his decision. He would not be part of their conquest. He did not know where he would go, or whether he would survive. But death in the sea was better than life under a flag of fire. He waited for his chance. The storm arrived before dawn. It began as a distant growl, a vibration under the planks. Then came the wind. First a sigh, then a scream. Rain hit the sails like stones, and the mast groaned. Men shouted, ropes snapped, and water poured over the deck in torrents. Amid the chaos, Johann's calm felt unnatural. He moved as if guided by invisible hands, climbing toward the small lifeboat secured at the stern. The watchman had abandoned his post to help with the sails. The moment was his. He threw in a few supplies, a jug of water, a handful of biscuits wrapped in cloth, his hammer, his knife. Lightning cracked the sky, turning the sea white for a heartbeat. He hesitated only once, glancing back at the ship, its lantern swaying wildly, its flag thrashing like a wounded thing, and then cut the rope. The lifeboat dropped, hit the waves, and nearly overturned. He grabbed the sides, drenched, breathless, as thunder rolled over him. The ship loomed above, massive and dark, but each surge of water carried him farther away. He could hear the shouts of men, the panic, the captain's orders, yet none of them saw him through the storm. Soon, even their voices were gone, swallowed by the roar of wind and sea. All through the night he rowed. The rain stung his eyes, salt burned his lips, and every pull of the oars felt like tearing muscle from bone. When exhaustion finally overcame him, he let the boat drift, his arms hanging limp. The sea calmed by degrees, as if tiring of its rage. The stars returned, faint behind scattered clouds, and he saw his reflection in the black water. Pale, hollow, but alive. He slept only when dawn began to rise behind him. The sun bled through the mist in colors of iron and ash. He awoke to the sound of gulls and the gentle lapping of waves against sand. The boat had run aground on a narrow beach, the sand pale and wet. For a long time he sat there, staring at the horizon. There was no sign of the Edelweiss, no smoke, no sail, just the endless line between sea and sky. He had escaped, though the word no longer meant freedom, but uncertainty. He stepped onto the shore, his legs trembling from fatigue. The air was heavy and warm, filled with the smell of earth and leaves. Behind the beach rose a wall of green trees, thick as columns, vines draped like veils, shadows shifting in the undergrowth. He felt both awe and dread. The forest seemed to breathe, to listen. He dragged the boat higher onto the sand and set about making a small fire. The wood was damp, but he worked patiently, striking sparks with his knife until smoke began to curl upward. When the first flames caught, he sat beside them and warmed his hands. The sound of the waves soothed him, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe he had found safety. He explored the beach, found a small stream where fresh water trickled from the rocks. He drank deeply, washed his face, and looked up at the canopy of leaves that filtered the sunlight into trembling gold. Insects buzzed in the air, unseen birds cried somewhere above. The island was alive. Yet as he walked farther, unease settled over him. The sand near the tree line bore marks, not of animals, but of feet. bare, human, and recent. He crouched, tracing the outline with a finger. The print was smaller than his, the toes delicate, the impression sharp. It was impossible to know how old it was, but it had not yet been touched by rain. He turned toward the forest, staring into its green depths. The sound of wind through the trees reminded him of whispers, words just beyond understanding. He told himself he was imagining it, that exhaustion played tricks on his mind. Still, he could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes watched from the shadows. As the sun lowered, he built a shelter from palm leaves and driftwood. He ate sparingly, drank again from the stream, and sat by his fire as darkness thickened around him. The stars here were brighter than any he had seen in Europe, scattered like shards of glass across the sky. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. But peace was fragile. When he lay down to sleep, the forest began to speak again. Rustles, sighs, the crack of a branch. His eyes opened wide. The fire flickered, its light stretching thin across the sand. He sat up, listening. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was too perfect, too deliberate. He waited, his knife resting across his knees, the heat of the dying fire warm against his skin. Then, just beyond the reach of the light, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, slow and silent. He froze. Nothing followed. The night deepened. The sea murmured in its ancient tongue, and at last, exhaustion pulled him down. When dawn came, the first thing he saw were the footprints. They surrounded his camp, circling the ashes of his fire, close enough that whoever had made them could have reached out and touched him as he slept. He rose slowly, the blood draining from his face. The prints were clear, leading back toward the forest. He stood there for a long time, the morning light spilling over him, and understood that his flight from men had not carried him into solitude after all. The island was not empty. He was not alone. And somewhere beyond the trees, the eyes that had watched him in the night were watching still. The morning unfolded with a deceptive calm, as if the island itself wished to lull Johann into forgetting the footprints that had encircled him during the night. The sea shimmered softly under the rising sun, and the tide whispered along the shore as though nothing at all had disturbed its rhythm. Yet he could not look at the sand without seeing the shapes left behind, narrow, delicate impressions that spoke of human presence. He had spent years working with wood, reading the grain of timber to know its story, and he could read these signs just as clearly. Someone had walked there not long ago. Someone had stood watching him sleep. He dismantled what remained of his makeshift shelter and packed his few possessions into the boat, though he had no intention of leaving. The fog that lingered far out at sea reminded him of how easy it would be to vanish forever between those gray curtains. The ocean, he decided, was no longer his ally. It had delivered him here, and now he belonged to the island, whether he wished it or not. He moved inland with slow, cautious steps, leaving behind the safety of the open shore. The forest swallowed him almost at once. The air grew thicker, dense with moisture, and the hum of unseen insects. Vines hung from the trees like ropes, and the ground was a patchwork of roots and leaves that softened under his boots. The scent of soil and decay filled his lungs, rich and intoxicating. Shafts of light broke through the canopy above, glinting off the smooth surfaces of enormous leaves. For a time, he could almost forget his fear. The island seemed untouched, a world that had existed long before his own. He saw butterflies large as his hands, lizards sunning themselves on rocks, birds of such bright colors that they seemed painted by imagination. He walked for what might have been hours until the trees began to thin. Ahead lay a small clearing, and in its center rose a circle of stones. At first, he thought them the work of nature, worn smooth by rain and wind. But as he drew closer, the symmetry revealed itself. The stones formed a perfect ring, each one angled toward the center, where ashes still clung to blackened soil. Kneeling, Johann brushed the dirt with his fingers and found that it crumbled easily, as though fire had touched it not years, but days before. A faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. He straightened slowly, his heart beating faster. Someone lived here. Someone had made fire and walked barefoot upon the sand. The realization both comforted and terrified him. After so long alone, he had yearned for another human presence, yet now that it seemed certain, the thought chilled him. He continued deeper into the island, following a narrow trail that wound between tree trunks and disappeared into the shadows. The path felt deliberate, worn smooth by many feet over many years. He saw carvings on the bark of certain trees, spirals, faces, symbols he could not decipher. Once, he found a wooden figure half buried in moss, its surface darkened by age. It depicted a human form, arms raised, eyes hollow. The expression carved into its face was neither kind nor cruel. It was something older, something beyond emotion. The further he went, the more signs he found. Shards of pottery lay among the roots, etched with lines that might have once been art or writing. Stones stacked into small pyramids dotted the ground like silent markers. He felt as though he had entered a cemetery, where every grave was a memory of those who had vanished. By midday, exhaustion and heat forced him to stop. He sat by a stream that trickled through the forest, its water cold and clear. He drank, splashing his face, and studied his reflection in the surface beard unkempt, eyes sunken but alert. The island had begun to change him. It stripped away the pretense of his old life, leaving only what was necessary: hunger, thirst, vigilance. He felt both diminished and purified. When he looked up again, he saw movement across the water, a flicker between trees, the curve of a shoulder, a glint of skin. He froze. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the shape vanished. Only the leaves stirred where something or someone had stood watching. Johann did not chase the figure. He knew enough about being hunted to understand the danger of turning pursuit into invitation. Instead, he backed away from the stream, his every sense sharpened. He returned toward the beach, marking his path with notches on the trunks so he could find his way back if needed. Yet each sound, each rustle, made him turn. The forest, so full of life before, now seemed crowded with eyes. When he finally reached the shore, evening had begun to fall. He rebuilt his shelter more carefully this time, arranging branches in a tight frame and spreading leaves over the top to conceal its shape. He gathered driftwood for the fire and placed stones in a circle around it. Then he sat, watching the flames grow. The sky darkened, and with it came the voices of the island, the distant cry of birds, the whisper of wind through the palms, the murmur of waves pulling back from the sand. Johann listened for the one sound he feared most. Footsteps. He did not have to wait long. Sometime past midnight, as the fire sank into embers, he heard it again. The soft crack of a twig, the shifting of leaves. He opened his eyes but did not move. The sound came from behind the shelter, slow, deliberate. It circled him, paused, then resumed. He imagined the faint silhouette of a figure just beyond the reach of the dying light. His heart pounded, yet he forced himself to stay still. The presence lingered, then withdrew. Silence followed, heavier than before. He waited until the horizon began to pale before daring to rise. The sand around his camp was smooth, undisturbed, except where the prints began, faint, shallow, moving back toward the forest. He followed them until they disappeared among the roots. There he found another sign, a small offering laid upon a rock, a shell filled with water, and beside it, a sprig of leaves. It was not a threat. It was a message. He left the gift untouched and returned to his camp, his mind turning in circles. If the island's inhabitants had wanted him dead, they would not have waited. He began to believe that they were watching to decide who he was, whether he came as enemy or guest. Perhaps they knew what kind of men usually arrived from across the sea, bringing iron and death. The thought filled him with shame. He had escaped that world, fled it. Yet here he was, a stranger with the same pale skin, the same foreign tools, the same hunger. If they judged him by those before him, he was already guilty. As days passed, he ventured farther inland. He tried to show respect, to move gently through the forest, to touch nothing he did not need. He repaired his small knife's handle, built traps that caught only fish, and left half of what he caught near the stream where he had seen the shadow. Each morning, when he returned, the offering was gone. The arrangement felt like an unspoken agreement, a fragile thread of peace. Then one morning, he found the traps destroyed, the fish scattered, and a mark carved into the nearest tree, a circle with a line through its center. It was not like the other carvings he had seen. This one was fresh. It felt like a warning. He spent the rest of the day uneasy, scanning the forest for signs of movement. By afternoon, he heard the first distinct human sound since his arrival. Voices. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable. He could not understand the words, yet the rhythm carried emotion, curiosity, argument, caution. Before he could move, something struck him from behind. He fell, the world spinning, sand and leaves blurring together. Rough hands seized his arms, twisting them behind his back. He tried to struggle, but the grip was iron. A voice barked an order, and the pressure eased only long enough for a loop of woven vine to bind his wrists. When they lifted him, he saw their faces. Men with dark skin painted in streaks of red and black, hair bound by cords, eyes sharp and unreadable. Their bodies were lean, their movements silent. There were 5 of them, and they regarded him not with hatred, but with grim curiosity. They led him through the forest in silence. Each time he stumbled, one of them pushed him upright without striking. The path wound upward, and soon the air grew cooler, touched by the scent of smoke. Then the trees opened into a wide valley. He stopped in awe. Before him lay a settlement unlike any he had imagined, dozens of huts built from branches and leaves, their roofs sloping low to the ground. Between them, small fires burned, sending thin trails of smoke into the sky. Children ran near the stream, women pounded roots in stone bowls, men carved tools from bone and wood. It was a living world, vibrant and organized, hidden from the eyes of any map. As they entered, silence rippled outward. Every face turned toward him. The children froze, the women stopped their work, and the men straightened, gripping their spears. He could feel their judgment as a physical weight pressing against his skin. The guards brought him to the center of the village, where a great fire burned within a circle of stones. There they pushed him to his knees. The crowd parted. A woman emerged, tall and straight-backed, her hair streaked with silver. Around her neck hung a pendant carved from polished bone, and her eyes, dark as obsidian, reflected the firelight. She moved with the authority of someone who had never been questioned. She stood before him for a long time, silent. The guard spoke to her quickly, gesturing toward Johann, miming his actions, his capture. She listened, then raised a hand to quiet them, her gaze fixed on his face, unblinking, and though he could not understand her language, he knew she was asking something. "Who are you? Why have you come?" He could not answer in words, so he bowed his head and pressed his bound hands to his chest, a gesture of submission, of peace. The murmurs around the fire grew softer. After a pause, the woman turned to the others and spoke. Her voice carried strength, but not cruelty. Whatever she said calmed them. 2 men stepped forward, pulled Johann to his feet, and guided him away from the fire. He expected a prison, perhaps death. Instead, they led him to a small hut at the edge of the settlement. The walls were woven from branches, the floor soft with leaves. They motioned for him to enter. When he hesitated, one of them pushed him gently inside. He stumbled, fell to his knees, and heard the sound of the entrance being sealed with a woven mat. The dim light inside smelled of earth and smoke. Through the small gaps in the wall, he could see the flicker of distant fires and the movement of shadows. Outside, the village began to hum again, the low rhythm of drums, the murmur of voices, the laughter of children. The sounds were strangely comforting, human in a way he had not heard in months. He sat in the darkness, his wrists still bound, and realized he no longer feared death as much as the possibility of misunderstanding. He had run from one world into another, and though this one did not yet welcome him, it had spared his life. That mercy felt heavier than any chain. He thought of the storm, of the ship that had carried him across the ocean, of the men who would soon land somewhere to claim land that was not theirs. He whispered a promise into the darkness that he would not become them, not here, not on this island that had chosen to test him. Outside, the drums continued, deep and patient, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The first sound Johann heard when he woke was rain. It fell softly upon the thatched roof above him, the rhythm steady and patient, like a slow pulse keeping time with his thoughts. For a moment, he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the woven walls of the hut, the faint glow of morning leaking through the gaps, and the smell of damp earth returned him to the truth. He was still a prisoner, though one kept alive, for reasons he could not yet name. Outside, the village murmured to life. Voices rose and faded, the low thud of tools against wood mingling with the laughter of children. Somewhere close by, smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of roasted roots and ash. Johann sat up slowly, his body stiff from sleeping on the ground. His wrists still bore the red marks where the vines had cut into his skin, but they hadn't tied him again after the night. The people of the island, it seemed, didn't bind what they no longer feared. When the flap of his hut lifted, light flooded in. One of the guards from the day before stood there, a tall man with dark eyes and paint streaked across his chest. He gestured for Johann to rise. Johann obeyed. The man said nothing, only motioned with a short nod and turned toward the path that wound between the huts. Johann followed. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, enough to darken the soil and beat upon the leaves. The villagers watched him as he passed. Some stared with open curiosity. Others turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. A few of the younger children crept closer, peering from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with the kind of wonder that belongs only to those who have not yet learned fear. Johann lowered his head in respect, moving quietly, careful not to step too near. They brought him again to the fire in the center of the village. The tall woman he had seen the night before, their leader, he assumed, was already there, standing beside the flame, as though it were a living thing that required her guidance. She spoke to the guard, who answered briefly, and then turned her gaze on Johann. It was the same measured look, deep and unflinching, as if she could read in him every lie he had ever told. She gestured toward a set of objects laid upon the ground, a bundle of vines, a bowl of water, and a few charred sticks. Johann stared, not understanding. The guard stepped forward and pointed toward the trees beyond the village. His tone was neither angry nor kind. It was instructional. The meaning slowly formed in Johann's mind. They were sending him away, not as punishment, but as trial. He was to find his way back to the sea, alone, carrying nothing but the things they had given him. No weapon, no food, no guide. The task was clear enough. He was being tested, not for strength, but for spirit. The woman spoke again, her voice low, melodic, but firm. When she finished, she reached into a pouch at her side and drew out a small piece of polished bone carved into the shape of a circle. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. For a moment, her hand remained there, warm and deliberate. Then she withdrew it and stepped back. Johann bowed his head. There were no words to say, no common language to bridge the distance between them. Yet he understood. He was being given a chance to prove himself to the island, to its people, and perhaps most of all, to himself. He turned toward the forest. The villagers parted as he passed. Beyond the last of their huts, the trees waited, vast and unknowable, their leaves whispering in the wind. He hesitated once, glancing over his shoulder. The woman still stood by the fire, watching him. When he took his first step into the shadows of the trees, she lifted her hand slightly, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. The forest swallowed him again. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world slick with moisture. Every leaf glistened, every sound magnified, the drip of water from branches, the distant call of unseen birds, the soft squelch of mud beneath his feet. He moved carefully, marking his path by instinct rather than sight, following the faint sense of direction that told him the sea lay somewhere beyond the hills. Hours passed, though the light beneath the canopy never changed enough to tell time. Hunger came first, then thirst. He drank from streams when he found them, using the bowl they had given him, and chewed on the roots and berries he recognized as safe. The island provided just enough for survival, but never more. It was as though it wished to remind him that he was a guest, not a master. As he walked, his thoughts turned inward. He thought of the ship he had left behind, of the men who would soon reach land and plant flags where people already lived. He thought of his brother, of the war that had hollowed them both out. He thought of the woman by the fire, her steady eyes, and the strange mercy she had shown. Each step he took felt like a slow shedding of his former life, of the noise and iron and arrogance that had once defined his world. When darkness began to fall, he built a small shelter from branches and leaves, just as he had on the shore. He lit no fire, fearing to draw attention, though part of him wondered whether the people of the island still watched him. He suspected they did. Somewhere among the trees, he thought he heard faint movement, the sound of feet too light to belong to animals. But no threat came. Only the night and the endless whisper of wind through the forest. Sleep came fitfully. Dreams of water and smoke haunted him. Visions of the ship breaking apart, of faces sinking beneath the waves, of a city burning on a horizon he would never see again. When he woke, his body was cold and damp, and the dawn was gray. He resumed his walk, driven by instinct alone. The path grew harder. The forest thickened, its roots twisting like serpents across the ground. Once, he slipped on a whetstone and fell, gashing his arm against a branch. Blood ran freely, and the pain reminded him of his own frailty. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound the wound. The simple act steadied him. Pain, he realized, was the only thing that belonged entirely to him. It could not be taken or shared. By midday, the air grew heavy, the heat pressing down like a hand. The sounds of the forest changed. The calls of birds faded, replaced by a deep, distant silence. He stopped, sensing something different. Ahead, the trees opened into a clearing, and through it, he glimpsed a sliver of blue, the sea. Relief surged through him. He quickened his pace. But as he stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath him gave way. The earth crumbled, and he slid down a slope of wet soil and vines, landing hard at the bottom. Dazed, he looked up. The slope was too steep to climb easily. He sat for a moment, catching his breath. Then he saw it. Before him stood a single tree, unlike any he had seen on the island. Its trunk was massive, its bark covered in carvings. Faces, animals, spirals, all interwoven into a tapestry of life and death. At its base lay stones arranged in a wide circle, much like the one he had found days earlier. But this one was intact, well kept, sacred. In its center, smoke rose from a bed of ashes. Someone had been here. Perhaps someone still was. He approached slowly, his steps measured. The air around the tree felt different, heavier, almost humming. He knelt by the circle and saw that the fire had been tended recently. Beside it lay a woven basket filled with shells, bones, and small carvings. A ritual space, perhaps, or a place of memory. He felt suddenly like an intruder and bowed his head in apology, whispering a prayer to whatever spirit guarded the place. When he lifted his eyes, he was no longer alone. Across the circle stood 3 figures, their faces painted, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, the woman with the silver-streaked hair watched silently. She had followed him, as he had guessed she might. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then she stepped forward, crossing the circle to stand before him. Her hand rose, pointing toward the sea visible beyond the trees. Then she touched the amulet still clutched in his hand. The gesture was clear. He had reached the end of his path. Johann bowed deeply, his throat tight. He had no words for gratitude, no way to explain the transformation that had taken root in him since leaving their village. The woman studied him, then extended her hand. In it was a small parcel wrapped in leaves. She placed it on the ground before him. When he opened it, he found food fruit, roots, and a piece of dried meat. A gift for the journey home. He looked up to thank her, but she had already turned away. The others followed her into the forest, vanishing among the trees until he stood alone once more. He walked toward the sound of waves. The sea opened before him, vast and endless, its color shifting from gray to blue under the returning sun. His small boat lay where he had left it, weathered but intact. Beside it rested a bundle of leaves, tied neatly with a cord. Inside was water, fruit, and at the very top, the carved bone amulet, now strung upon a loop of fiber meant to be worn. He placed it around his neck. The weight was light, yet it anchored him to the island more deeply than any chain could have. He pushed the boat into the shallows, climbed in, and began to row. The current caught him gently, carrying him away from the shore. He looked back once, and through the haze saw figures standing at the edge of the forest, the woman among them, her form steady against the wind. He raised his hand in silent farewell. The island, his judge and his teacher, grew smaller until it became only a shadow on the horizon. Days later, when he reached the mainland, he found not peace, but the clamor of men. The coast was dotted with crude camps and smoking fires. Flags fluttered above tents. Soldiers barked orders. Slaves carried supplies. It was a world he recognized too well, the mirror image of the one he had fled. He watched from a distance, hidden among the dunes, and felt no desire to join them. He walked north instead, along the shore, until the noise faded behind him, and the only sounds were wind and surf. In a small cove, he found a patch of flat land sheltered by rocks. There, he built a hut from driftwood and palm leaves. He caught fish, gathered rainwater, and lived simply, speaking to no one. Years passed. His hair grew gray, his beard thick. Those who glimpsed him from afar called him the German hermit, a madman who talked to the sea. He let them believe it. The world of men had no more claim on him. Each morning, he would walk to the water's edge and look east, where the horizon blurred into mist. Some days, when the air was very still, he thought he could see the outline of the island green and distant, like a memory refusing to fade. He would touch the amulet at his chest and close his eyes. He had gone there as a fugitive, a man fleeing guilt and war, and had left as something quieter, smaller perhaps, but more whole. The island had taken nothing from him except the illusion that a man could own what was never his to claim. Now, in the solitude he had once feared, he found peace. Not the peace of victory or of conquest, but the kind that grows from surrender. The peace of a man who had learned that the truest form of strength is refusal. And though the years continued their slow erosion, though the sea gnawed at the shore and storms tore at his roof, Johann never forgot the woman with the silver hair or the silent people of the island who had taught him how to live without taking. When he finally closed his eyes for the last time, the sound he heard was not the crash of waves, but the gentle murmur of rain on leaves, the heartbeat of the island, echoing softly in his memory, as if it had been waiting all along to welcome him home. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more journeys to discover. And share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.